Welcome to Campfire Stories.
Pull up close tonight, because this one starts in the port of Greenhithe, England, in the spring of 1845, and it ends well. It ends in a silence so complete that people are still listening for the echo of it 180 years later. I'm Marty Shepherd, and this is The Fire. Welcome.
And I'm Carol, and I will tell you right now, I have been waiting for Marty to tell this one for a long time. Get comfortable. This is a big one.
129 men. 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, which, even for the Royal Navy, are names that should have given somebody pause. They were the finest Arctic vessels in the world. Iron-reinforced hulls, steam-powered locomotives retooled to drive propellers, enough provisions for 3 years. The Victorians had loaded those ships the way a person packs for a camping trip when they've never actually been camping. They brought a library of over 1,000 books, a hand organ, silver cutlery monogrammed with the officers' family crests. The Empire was going to find the Northwest Passage, and it was going to do it in style.
The monogrammed cutlery is what gets me every time. There's something so touchingly human about that, like, yes, we may be sailing into the most unforgiving wilderness on Earth, but we will be dining properly.
Their commander was Sir John Franklin, 60 years old, stout, experienced enough, and beloved by his men in the way that a man is beloved when he is kind and they haven't yet found out what he can't do. He'd been to the Arctic before, survived a terrible overland expedition 20 years earlier where men had eaten their own boots, and somehow that story had become part of his legend rather than a warning. In England he was the man who ate his boots in the Arctic. Boots don't keep.
I always think about his wife, Lady Jane Franklin. She was sharp as a tack, practically organized the search expeditions herself when the Navy dragged its feet. She waited and fought and funded ships for over a decade. That kind of love is its own kind of navigation.
The ships were spotted in late July of that year, 1845, by 2 whaling vessels in Baffin Bay. The crews waved across the water. And that wave was the last time anyone outside the Arctic saw a single one of those 129 men alive. They sailed north and west into the labyrinth of ice and islands above Canada, and the world simply never heard from them again.
No radio, no satellite, no way to call for help. Just ice in every direction, and the understanding that a letter home might take a year to arrive. I genuinely cannot imagine writing that last letter knowing what you knew.
We know some of what happened from 2 sources, and the tension between those sources is its own kind of mystery. The first source is a single sheet of paper found years later, stuffed into a cairn of rocks on a place called Victory Point on King William Island. It had been written twice, first in 1847 when things were still officially going fine, all well, it said. Then someone had written around the margins, in the spring of 1848, the real news. Franklin was dead. 24 other officers and men were dead. The ships had been locked in the ice for a year and a half. And on the 22nd of April, 105 survivors were abandoning the vessels and walking south. That note is the only written record we have. 105 men walked off into the tundra and left behind 1 page of paper.
1 page for 105 people. Someone made a decision about what to carry and what to leave, and they left almost everything.
The second source is the Inuit, the Netzilik people who lived in that part of the world and had for generations, and who had every skill the Navy officers had dismissed as primitive. Over the following years, search expeditions finally sent out by a worried England collected Inuit testimony, and the picture that emerged was devastating. Inuit hunters and their families had encountered the dying men, staggering across the ice, dragging heavy boats on sleds, some of them already snowblind, some of them behaving strangely, some of them beyond help. They offered food. They tried to trade. The few survivors who could still speak gestured to their mouths and their throats. Some of the Inuit accounts describe things we don't need to describe on a night like this. The men were not themselves at the end. The Arctic had taken something from them before it took everything.
The Inuit remembered them. That's the thing that makes me catch my breath. Those stories were passed down carefully with respect for what they'd witnessed. They were the only record those men had left in the world, held in somebody else's memory.
There's a scientific coda to this that came much later. In the 1980s, a researcher named Owen Beatty led a team to Beechey Island, where 3 of Franklin's men had been buried in the first winter, 1846, long before disaster struck. The permafrost had preserved them so well it's almost unsettling. After 140 years, they still had hair, still had skin. And the autopsies found something. The men had extraordinarily high levels of lead in their bones. The leading theory is the tin cans. The Navy had provisioned those ships with 8,000 tins of preserved food, and the seams were soldered with lead so sloppily that it was leaching directly into the food. 129 men, eating lead with every meal, for months and years. It might explain the strange behavior the Inuit described. It might explain the terrible judgment. The empire that couldn't imagine failure had poisoned its own expedition.
They brought the wrong kind of confidence, didn't they? All that technology, all that silver cutlery, and the thing that killed them might have been a badly sealed can of soup. Marty, I think Alfred Hitchcock would have loved this story.
He would have put the tin can in the first scene, Carol. Right, where you could see it but didn't know what you were looking at. That's exactly what happened in real life. Everything you needed to understand the ending was there at the beginning, and nobody saw it. Now, here's the part that I find genuinely haunting, and I say that as a man who does most of his haunting from a recliner.
Go on, I'm already hugging this blanket tighter.
The ships themselves, Erebus and Terror, were missing for 168 years. Somewhere under the cold water of the Canadian Arctic, in an area the Inuit had been quietly pointing searchers toward for over a century, those ships were waiting. Erebus was found in 2014. Terror in 2016. And when Diverse finally went down, the ships were in remarkable condition. Intact. A window still in its frame. Pots still in the galley. A desk drawer, slightly open, with something inside it that the cameras could see but couldn't quite read. The library was down there. The silver cutlery. The hand organ. 168 years under the ice, and the ships were more intact than anyone had dared to hope. They'd been preserved by the very thing that killed the men who sailed them.
Oh, that is almost too poetic to be true, and it's completely true. The ice kept them safe, just not the men.
Lady Franklin never stopped believing the ships could be found, but she died before anyone found them in 1875. She had spent decades and a considerable fortune and relentless, magnificent stubbornness pushing for searches, for answers, for the truth. She's buried in London, and there's a monument to Franklin at Westminster Abbey with an inscription she chose herself, from Tennyson. Not here, the white north has thy bones, and thou, heroic sailor soul, art passing on thine happier voyage now. She decided what the story meant, and she inscribed it in stone, and I think she was right that it needed meaning because otherwise it's just loss.
She gave him a narrative when the ice had taken everything else. That's love doing the heaviest kind of work.
What stays with me, after all of it, is the gap between what those men thought they were sailing into and what the Arctic actually is. They had the best technology their world could offer. They had experience, courage, provisions, a library of 1,000 books, and the Arctic simply didn't care. It isn't cruel. That's the thing. It's just indifferent, and there is nothing more humbling than genuine indifference. The Inuit had lived there for generations by learning its terms, not their own. The Navy tried to bring its own terms north with it, on 2 iron-reinforced ships named, of all things, for dread and terror, and the ice held them for a winter and a second winter, and that was that.
My grandmother used to say, the wilderness doesn't hate you, it just doesn't know you're there. I used to think that was comforting. Tonight it feels a little different.
There's one more thing I keep coming back to. That note found at Victory Point, the one with all well written in 1847, and the bad news crowded into the margins in 1848. Someone carried that note south when they walked off the ship. Someone had it in their pack, or their coat. And then they put it in a cairn under some rocks in one of the most remote places on Earth, and walked on. They did not know if anyone would ever find it. They left it anyway. They needed someone to know what had happened. I find that very human. The impulse to say, we were here, this is what it cost. Someone remember us.
And someone did. We're sitting here tonight, 180 years later, saying their names next to a fire. I think that matters. I genuinely think that counts.
The Northwest Passage was finally navigated in 1906 by Roald Amundsen in a small wooden boat with a crew of 6 using Inuit techniques. They ate seal meat and wore animal skins and moved with the ice instead of against it. It took 3 winters and everyone came home. The right lesson had been there all along, waiting in the knowledge of the people who already knew how to live in that world. Some things don't yield to ambition. They only yield to respect. And the 129 men of the Franklin expedition remind us from the bottom of a very cold sea that the difference between those two things can be everything. I'm Marty Shepherd.
Sleep warm tonight, friends, and maybe leave the cutlery at home. Just a thought.